only one of the dogs, to be fair to Paw Patrol, only one of the dogs is a cop. They're a rescue team. Although quite what the roles of each individual pup is, I'm not 100% sure.
I'm just blown away, actually, on a wider issue, a wider note, what children find popular and what they do not. Like, there's a plethora of shows to watch, but it always organised must be Paw Patrol. It's quite bizarre. I mean, I look at it with my adult eyes, I see nothing in it apart from flashy lights and
Animals.
They love. Is that what it is?
I think children and animals. There's something about children and animals. There's an affinity there.
Right.
For most, I think it's a natural, something natural about kids and animals being together. So that part of it makes really good sense for me.
Am I the only person here who's at all upset to discover that even when it comes to social media and television, turns out the President of the United States still doesn't know what's going on?
Well,
Isn't that amazing?
to be fair, this wasn't a speech that he gave.
On his behalf, though.
It was given on his behalf, and we would expect that to reflect the views. I just think I read a headline today that said, White House press office can't understand memes.
Oh, well, someone...
Yeah.
And
okay.
I thought if you showed that sentence to me 3 years ago, I would look at you blankly.
But a bit of response here. There's a huge... Paw Patrol is fantastic, says someone in 6 exclamation marks. But another one says, look, Paw Patrol has only one female and multiple males. She only wears pink and is never at the front. It's super sexist and should be cancelled. So I'll go home tonight and have a bit of a look.
Could I also say, Wallace, you're wearing a very fetching jumper this morning. It's terrific. I love it.
Highly...
It's pink.
It's very...
pink.
Look, tell you what...
Very metro.
I think
You
Wallace,
might not see it, but I do love my pink. I love my pink.
it's anthropomorphized animals as well.
Right.
So animals that act like people are absolute catnip for us as viewers, especially as kids, I think.
That's true.
But yeah, it's an interesting moment, and hopefully there won't be another victim of cancel culture. Cops and Live PD are gone for good.
They're gone.
And their publisher A&E, the channel that runs them, their ratings have dropped over 40% since they stopped airing those 2 shows.
Thank you, Robert. Meanwhile, a few Captain Pugwash fans coming through.
Oh, well, that's good to know. You know, Wallace, there was also, I remember another show from my childhood,
Yeah.
Listen with Mother with Kate Harcourt.
Listen with Mother.
She had hippopotamuses, and the song went like this, and you'll have to excuse whatever.
for it.
My toothbrush has gone down the plug hole. My flannel is flung on the floor. I used all the soap blowing bubbles, so I don't have to wash anymore.
Fantastic. Oh, it's
Animals.
impressive
Animals.
that you remember that. That is impressive.
I'll go to my grave remembering.
That was fantastic.
There's a text here that says again, but well, maybe toward the end of the show, eh? Time for I've been thinking. You've got a bit of an essay there, Simon, so why don't we kick off with you?
Because it's an essay. Okay, right.
Well, not
so
an essay, but
I've been
a
wondering.
few
I've been
words.
thinking, yes, is youth an impediment to politics? Too many young people are going into politics with too little life experience. Is that right? I think it's nonsense. Some of our best politicians have been young. Their youth has been integral to what makes them good, and for decades that's been true on both sides. The great Marilyn Waring became an MP at 23, so did her colleague Simon Upton, and he became a cabinet minister at 32. Waring was one of the most admirable, hard-working and principled MPs we've ever had. Upton had no trouble adhering to integrity in public life either. In Labour, Helen Clark was an MP at 24, again in the company of many other young MPs. Jacinda Ardern and Nikki Kay were 28. Chloe Swarbrick, like Marilyn Waring, was 23. On the other hand, there have always been older members of Parliament, their minds made rigid by their life experience, who clog up every chance of progress. We can all think of a few right now, I'm sure. Age isn't a determinant of quality, but if anything, it's talented young people who will save this country, and we need more of them. The problem isn't youth, the problem is bullies, who come in all ages. They don't slip through the screening system, they're not aberrations. So often they are what the system is designed to find. Bullies, with their cocky confidence, their determination to get their own way, their low capacity for compassion, their belief other people are inferior to them, their need to be admired, and their conviction that other people are put on earth to gratify their personal urges. Bullies with, above all, their entitlement, their belief that they deserve all the rewards they can get their hands on because they are special. If you meet a bully in Parliament, in business, in leadership everywhere, the chances are they were chosen for the job because they are bullies. They're described like this: a fine young man who knows how to get things done. And gosh, he's a bit of a larrikin too. The problem isn't that they're young. Entitled older people make horrible bullies. It's the nods and winks involved in get things done and bit of a larrikin. All the weak people have to get out of the way because, you know, boys will be boys. That's what has to stop.
Well said.
Very good, Simon Wilson. And let's move over to Gornars Basamtabar, where I've been thinking.
I've been thinking about the latest incident with the influencer complaint that was upheld by the Advertising Association against a few posts and stories by an influencer. That's now opened the floodgates to both complaints being laid with the authority, but also, how do you police the nature of social media content in terms of individuals posting with products in their post from brand partners, and whether the advertising authority understands the difference between, for example, a sponsored post and a gifted post. And I'm not sure if the people there that are making the decisions actually quite understand the transient nature of, for example, 24-hour stories on Instagram that come and go and they're gone forever, and whether, you know, they understand the nature of being paid for a post or being given something to try and then talking about it if you actually like it. And most influencers won't, if they don't like a product, they won't talk about it. They'll just not mention it at all. So when they talk about a product that's been gifted to them and they haven't been paid for it, they are endorsing it, but they weren't given money in exchange for the content that they've produced. So now they're do you understand what I'm saying?
A bit more nuanced.
Oh, very. And also, you know, there was recently a complaint made against an influencer that I work with that was that the font on her story was too small and it wasn't clear enough that it was an ad. So how long is a piece of string in these situations? And so the authority decided that they weren't going to proceed with the complaint, but they just notified her of it that this.
Yes, I know the case. That's right. Isn't there a simple way to go? Can't you just hashtag gifted?
This one she had. So this is a different one to the one you're talking about. This one she had hashtagged gifted, but the complaint was that the font was too small on the story that she'd created. So it's interesting to see the industry, the associations, the authorities now taking submissions on guidelines for the industry, and they're welcoming, you know, feedback from both influencers and PR companies, etc. But it's interesting to see how something like this will be policed, because there's also the case of people just don't like other people, so they're going to lay complaints against the posts and content that they're making, and so it's just going to be funny to see how they're going to police that one, because it's also, well, how do you... One influencer said to me, I have deliverables. So, for example, I'll have an agreement and there'll be four posts that I'll have to make. Sometimes I'll do a fifth or a sixth out of my own goodwill. So how do you police that?
Okay, thank you very much, Gornars. A bit of response to Simon's. Thank you, Simon. Great to hear someone speak positively about young people on the panel. Simon Wilson and Gornars Basamtabar with me this afternoon. I'm Wallace Chapman, 4 to 5. Stay with us.
RNZ News at 4. I'm Paul Brennan. Nationals leader Judith Collins has promised to release the party's internal polling to her own MPs to prove last night's poll was an outlier. The opposition party was dealt a devastating blow yesterday with the latest News Hub Reid Research poll putting National on just 25.1%. Labour was on nearly 61%. Ms Collins says it's not a true reflection of the public sentiment, and its own polling has National much closer to 40%. She says she will release the internal polling to her caucus tomorrow. And the National Party is promising, if elected, to fast-track a rural ring road around Palmerston North, designed to divert heavy traffic away from central streets. Judith Collins made the announcement during a visit to the city, saying work would begin within 6 months of taking office. She says the roughly $200 million project would be funded out of National's already announced $31 billion transport package.
National wants to see freight trucks rumbling along fit-for-purpose highways en route to the North Island's ports, not hurtling past primary schools on streets that they shouldn't be using.
Judith Collins says she'll announce more transport funding for Otaki next week and then Wellington. The lawyer for Joseph Onga Matamata says his client's disappointed in the sentence and conviction. In the High Court at Napier today, Matamata was sentenced to 11 years in prison after earlier being convicted of human trafficking and slavery. He still maintains his innocence. Defence lawyer Roger Phillips says Matamata will get legal advice on whether to appeal against the conviction and sentence. Auckland's District Health Board has been found in breach of code over the death of a man from a brain bleed. The man, who was in his 70s, had undergone surgery at a private hospital for a brain tumour. After developing deep vein thrombosis and being moved to a public hospital, he was given a high dose of heparin, which caused a brain bleed and killed him. Commissioner Anthony Hill says the Auckland DHB offered inadequate support to junior staff and there was poor communication from senior doctors about the man's treatment. He recommended a review of the board's processes and an audit of neurosurgical services and for the DHB to apologise to the man's family. US diplomats in China have been leaving a consulate in the country's southwest as its closure looms. The ABC's Bill Birtles reports.
Over the weekend, removalist trucks were seen leaving as a heavy police presence kept onlookers and media away. China ordered the closure of the consulate as retaliation for Washington forcing dozens of Chinese diplomats to leave their consulate in Houston. The Trump administration ordered the shutdown, claiming Chinese diplomats were carrying out espionage and intellectual property theft, a claim China rejects.
Bill Birtles reporting there. Convicted rapist and former Fiji Sevens rugby star Amanoni Nasilasila is appealing against his 8-year sentence. Nasilasila, who was jailed in September for raping a young woman, appeared in a Suva court today. The 26-year-old has been at the centre of outrage in recent weeks following reports he's been training with a top local rugby club. Women's rights advocates and civil society groups have condemned the Corrections Service over its apparent preferential treatment of high-profile prisoners. The Fiji Times reported the state had been instructed to file its response before September the 15th, when the matter is called. It's still unclear how long the main route into Kaitaia will remain after a massive slip closed State Highway 1 at the Mangamuka Gorge. Far North District or Deputy Mayor Ann Court says it's taking a toll on Kaitaia and causing frustration for motorists.
I've been advised that it's multiple slips and it's still moving. It's the perfect storm, which is really frustrating for commuters.
Trees and soil came down in the heavy rain and floods.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Good afternoon. This week, the government continues to focus on our COVID response and recovery. I'm in the House on Tuesday and Wednesday, and also on Wednesday I will join a morning tea held by Rural Women New Zealand to help thank the essential workers and volunteers that supported New Zealanders during the Level 4 lockdown. On Thursday morning, I am speaking at a Wellington Chamber of Commerce event, also with a COVID-19 focus, before heading to Lower Hutt to meet with key COVID-19 community responders and to make an infrastructure announcement. On Friday, I am in Auckland at several events, including a Sir Edmund Hillary virtual reality project and a sod turning at a Papakainga housing development. Throughout the week, I also have calls with international leaders to share updates on our COVID response and position for economic recovery. And we'll also hold meetings with our tourism leaders, farming leaders, and the Council of Trade Unions. Ministers this week will be making important announcements around overhauling the RMA, regional infrastructure investments to create jobs and stimulate the economy, and health investments to help keep people safe and well. And you may have seen that Minister O'Connor has shown support today for a new primary sector campaign to connect 10,000 New Zealanders to food and fibre jobs over the next 4 years, aptly named Opportunity Grows Here. Today I'm joined by the Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins for an update on the government's work to support our education sector. New Zealand's position on COVID when compared to the world is one that has put us in a good position thanks to collective efforts, leading to one of the most open economies in the world and lots of freedom to move around the country. But it's a position that requires ongoing focus and management, particularly at our borders, and investment to support our industries, which have been hit the hardest. International education is our 5th largest export earner and contributed nearly $5 billion to our economy in 2018. Like many sectors that rely on international visitors, international education providers have suffered enormously due to the current travel restrictions. That's why today the government is investing $51.6 million from the COVID Recovery Fund to help protect jobs and stabilise the sector. You recall when we announced the tranche of funding, we gave indications that we would be using the CRRF for investments in core services such as health and education where they were impacted from COVID. New Zealand's international education sector has an opportunity to benefit from our strong health response, which means we're one of the few countries in the world where students can come to study and be safe from COVID. This can be, in the future, a significant strategic advantage. So today we set out our investment in the sector to cushion the blow and to set out a path for recovery to help the sector rebuild and get our international export sector back on track when we are able. This work sits within the government's final plank of our 5-point economic recovery plan to continue to position New Zealand globally as a place to trade with, to invest with, in, and eventually visit again. I'll now hand over to the Minister of Education, who'll give you more details.
Thank you, Prime Minister. COVID-19 has meant that international education providers, especially providers like English language schools, have suffered a sudden and dramatic loss of their revenue. We won't be able to save every single job in international education with the $51.6 million that we are announcing today, but it will certainly help to cushion the blow. The government has, as part of this work, developed a 3-part strategic plan to rebuild the international education sector based on the 3 pillars of stabilising, strengthening and transforming international education. To stabilise our international education system, we're investing $20 million for state and state integrated schools for the remainder of this year to help them cope with the reduction in revenue. $10 million for private training establishments, including English language schools, to buffer the sharp decline in their revenue, but also to maintain a good foundation level of PTE provision for when the sector is able to more fully reopen. $10 million is being invested to develop new products and services to drive growth in the future, for example, by allowing students to study from their home countries before coming to New Zealand to complete their studies. We're setting aside funding so providers can continue to provide pastoral care for the international students that are still here in New Zealand, so that we can deliver English language training to migrants, and so that we can release marketing campaigns to keep our brand visible overseas while travel restrictions are still in place. The investment that we're announcing today builds on the work that the government has already been doing to support providers and students, such as enabling PTEs to hibernate, establishing an international student hardship fund, and removing the requirement for providers to pay the export education levy both this year and next year. I know much of the recovery is dependent on when New Zealand will be able to reopen our borders to international students. As we've noted many times, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage overseas, and we'd be expecting providers to plan for no additional international students for the rest of this year, with a view to bringing in smaller cohorts than they may have previously expected next year. Thank you, Prime Minister.
All right, we're now happy to take questions. Just a second.
Minister, can I just ask who qualifies for this funding?
So schools, the allocation to schools will be based on the revenue loss that they have experienced. And so there'll be a formula, and we'll be working through schools to make sure that the allocation of that funding is fair, bearing in mind that for schools that have only a small number of international students, the transition cost is not likely to be large. But some schools do have a very large number of international students, and they're likely to be the ones who have a bigger transition. For private training establishments, there'll be a process that we'll go through with private training establishments, setting out a criteria that includes, for example, those that will be strategically important to our recovery, and making sure that we're maintaining that base level of provision there so that when we need it, we can draw on it.
Be giving some providers false hope, though, if they see this pot of money that they can't access?
Look, the criteria, I'm actually meeting with them at 7 o'clock tonight to lay out a bit more detail, more of the process for them, so that they'll know exactly what to expect. So I don't expect that by the end of today anybody will receive false hope.
Why not?
Oh, look, well, just one at a time.
Sorry,
let me
why
finish
are
that
unis
line.
and politics part of this?
The universities and politics, of course, sit on the Crown's balance sheet, so we're already providing support to the public institutions. Schools are a little different in that they're smaller in scale. They have less ability to absorb that kind of shock within their balance sheet. Politics, as you'll know, there's a big reform program going on at the moment in the politics sector, and we are putting extra funding into them. And the universities have very healthy balance sheets. No university is going to go broke in the short term because of the decline in international students. I know that it will put a strain on their finances, but they are well positioned to weather that.
Why not put this money, or some of this money, into efforts to actually allowing international students to come into the country?
I'll start just very briefly and then hand over to the Minister. I mean, we do need to take into account the sheer scale of the international education sector. So in 2018, I think roughly we were talking 117,000 students. When you factor in that since we started our quarantine system, we've had a total of 31,000 returning New Zealanders come through it. So that gives you a sense of the scale. We are looking to the prospects for the sector in the future where we can manage them as part of quarantine, but that is not something that we can safely do immediately. That is going to take some time, and we will need to continue to work with the sector on that.
Yeah, look, we're absolutely working very closely with the sector at the moment. Of course, I know they want faster progress, but we have a difficult balancing act here around preserving New Zealand public safety and making sure that our quarantine and managed isolation arrangements are as robust as possible, whilst also trying to set up new things that will help us to bring international students in.
Is the election holding up any progress here? Are you worried about any risk or too much risk?
No,
not
at all.
The judgment, of course, needs to be exactly the same. The question here is, what does it take to make sure that we ensure the health and safety of New Zealanders? And that judgment, that equation doesn't change, regardless of what's happening in the political cycle. Okay.
When will you be able to give the sector that certainty that you're talking about? Because this won't even scratch the surface, will it?
So look, I'm meeting with them tonight, and obviously I know that there'll be a lot of discussion about the package that we announced today and about the pressure that they are under. There is no question that for international education, as there is for tourism, there are going to be some tough decisions that they are going to face in the immediate future, and we'll certainly work with them around that. With regard to the border, there are a whole lot of things that the government is working its way through at the moment. We will move as quickly as we can to provide more certainty, but at the moment we're not in a position to put a specific date on when we might be able to bring international students in.
To be clear, you do see a case for just international students coming in at some point for a system where students can come in that maybe tourist can't because they're staying for a long term.
Look, again, those are the sorts of things that Megan Woods and I are both working through, and we've yet to take recommendations to Cabinet around that. But prioritisation of people coming into the country is something that the Cabinet is very actively looking at.
International students for quarantine if and when you allow them to come in?
Absolutely, it would be a full cost recovery. We wouldn't be subsidising bringing international students back in.
Yep.
Next year, the health situation is likely to be probably not too much better. I'm not really too sure, but it's still getting worse internationally. So by the beginning of next year, it still won't look great. So is the reason this is being put off until then purely for logistics and to get things sorted?
Look, it's largely is logistics. We, of course, will be looking at how we can bring in low-risk cohorts of international students first, and how we can then minimise the risk when they're here. What can we do in their home countries to reduce risk? What can we do in the process of bringing them here to reduce risk? And then, of course, we're going to have very robust arrangements in place around managed isolation when they first arrive, and testing to make sure that we're not creating the risk that international students will bring COVID into the country.
Do we have you talked to the Prime Minister about the 117,000 students that come in annually. Do we have a capacity problem? Is that kind of key to not being
No, I think keeping in mind actually the large number of people that we have, over 31,000 that we've had today, come through our facilities. That's a significant rate when you think about what's, the number that, for instance, has come through, say, New South Wales. So I think we are keeping pace in terms of the scale of our operation. Really, that was an acknowledgement that there's a very large number of individuals who are international students or have been in the past who have sought to study in New Zealand, that whenever you start doing something at scale, that their risk comes with that, and we're just not willing to jeopardise our health response by scaling up to something that we just can't do well. We have to constantly make sure we balance all of these decisions and that our primary focus is the health and safety of New Zealanders, and that's how we guard our economy.
letting in international students because you don't think we could properly...
No, again, 117,000 students is a large number when you take into account that when we're just factoring in at the moment the number of citizens and the number of permanent residents we have coming in, that's equated to about 31,000. That's still a large number to have successfully moved through quarantine. We don't want to sacrifice, though, our response at the border by scaling up to an initiative that A, means that we have other people who can't come in first, but B, means that we might have quality control issues as we go.
The one said that there would be a decision made on charging returnees before the end of the month. This is the last cabinet of the month. Was it discussed today and was a decision made?
Of course, there are still cabinet committees. As soon as we have a decision, we will be sharing it with you. As soon as we have a decision, we'll be sharing it with you. But do keep in mind we have a number of cabinet committees still operating as well.
Some people, all Kiwis overseas right now who might be trying to plan trips home right now and work out if they can come home, who are kind of waiting for a decision about whether they need to come home immediately to avoid a charge or might have to save up another $3,000. Don't you have some sympathy for that?
Look, again, our focus is on making sure that when those individuals come home, they can do so safely, that we can look after them and we can make sure that COVID doesn't enter our community. So that's our primary focus. When it comes to a charging regime, we've always indicated that it is something that would require legislative footing, so it's not something that's just simply going to happen at a quick pace. It needs to be done right. Secondly, there's a number of factors we need to weigh up. Keeping in mind, though, that this isn't about charging for the sake of managing the number of people who come in. We've used alternative means to do that. Charging is really about making sure it's equitable.
Will you be able to do that within the sitting block if you do come to a decision?
Sorry?
Will you be able to do that within the sitting block?
I think you'd want to make sure that you move fairly promptly on it once a decision is made.
Jessica. Will you then have to plan for the influx of people
Again,
coming in?
you'll have seen that we're already managing the flow, and that's something that needs to happen regardless, because we need to, again, maintain the quality of our quarantine, and that means making sure you have a manageable and planned number of people coming at any time. That's something we've already had to address, so we've worked directly with the airlines on that.
Modelling on what would happen if you changed the rules and say, look, in a week and a half, we're going to
No, so remember, just keeping in mind, we have already put in place measures that help us manage flow. And so those, of course, continue to be important because what you wouldn't want to see is a sudden spike when we need to make sure that we have a plan around the number we can expect at any given time. That was an issue we had some weeks ago. Of course, you remember that we were getting passenger manifests quite close to the time when planes were departing. That wasn't an easy way to operate either for those operating the facility or when it came to bringing more facilities on stream. So we've got on top of that by working with the airlines directly.
So you'll
scaling up ahead of that announcement?
No, we've generally have been scaling up just to manage the demand, but at the same time, we've also been working with airlines to make sure that we didn't have large bubbles of people coming through. We've had to spread the flow, and that's simply to maintain the quality of what's happening at our quarantine facilities.
Prime Minister, somewhat related to this.
Yeah, Ben.
Somewhat related to this, but as a foreigner asking a question about the New Zealand electoral system, I'm a bit nervous about this one, but I understand that if you're an overseas-based Kiwi, you can vote in the election, but you have to have set foot in New Zealand.
Within the last 3 years.
Yeah,
correct.
But at the moment, it's actually very challenging to get home. So it's possible that the current arrangement's disenfranchising some Kiwis from voting.
I don't think I'd accept that. I don't know how many New Zealanders specifically make the effort to touch their feet on New Zealand soil in order to maintain their ability to vote. Look, if they do that, I'm very heartened by that level of commitment to the New Zealand electoral cycle. But I'm not sure that I think it's probably more the fact that New Zealanders who do frequently come back are maintaining that connection and therefore maintain the ability to vote.
If there was a fix to it, though, would you be interested in it?
I don't think it would be particularly easy. You would have to determine and demonstrate intent to return. I don't think that's something that we could create an easy legislative fix for. For anyone who's caught up in those circumstances, of course, I'm saddened by it. I want people to feel like they maintain that connection. But, of course, voting is only one way to demonstrate your connection to New Zealand.
So just a question from another foreigner who enrolled to vote last week. Just on an unrelated
None of you should feel obliged to give any kind of credentials before asking your question. This is a welcome environment.
Beirut Bhutani was last week granted refugee status. The opposition leader today, Judith Collins, described it as a very interesting situation that needs a bit more blowtorch to it. What do you say to suggestions of political interference?
Well, just simply that they're wrong. And I think it does a disservice to our public service to imply that there's been any role for anyone other than those who have an official role, and it is kept entirely separate from politicians, and that is as it should be.
What do you, just on that, what do you make of New Zealand First tweeted over the weekend, this is why they need the Minister of Immigration portfolio?
Well, that again would be asserts that the Minister of Immigration has a role in a decision like this. You can understand why it is so important that any decision around refugee status or asylum seekers, that we keep that separate from politicians. Because often people will be seeking that status off the back of prior political advocacy or connection. So that is something that we keep very distinct in the New Zealand system, and that has certainly been the case here.
What do you make of the rhetoric behind the statement that New Zealand
that it's election year? Yeah.
Why did a release about migrant exploitation measures come through Peters' office?
Sorry, why did you'd have to give me a little bit more context there if you can.
There's a couple of measures around migrant exploitation and a new type of visa, and it seems to have come from Mr. Peters' office plus...
How do you mean from Mr. Peters' office?
Well, it's headlined from Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Peters.
Okay. I'd need a little bit more detail if I may. It is fair to say that the Deputy Prime Minister has been involved with work on repatriation of RSC workers, so there is some relevance there for his portfolio. A lot of advocacy has had to go into supporting RSC workers to be able to return to home country where they have wanted to, where there's been a reluctance to allow them. So there has been a role for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I know there was a recent case, of course, where there was reluctance to return because of a concern that a migrant exploitation case wouldn't be heard or considered appropriately. So I could see how those two issues could combine.
The thing is, just on managed isolation and charging for it, are you looking for agreement from your fellow coalition partners? Because there's legislative change required, so
that's a given. We look for that on everything that we do.
Or are you looking for support across the aisle?
No, look, that hasn't been the case or necessary on the vast majority of the things that we've done. No, it's simply a matter of finalising all the policy detail and work on these questions and making some final decisions. And after we've done that, we'll be making announcements. Audrey.
Have you or Chris Hipkins had any update on the South Korean case?
Yes.
Tested positive?
Yes, I'll leave that to Minister Hickins.
Yeah, so we have asked for a second test to be undertaken, so we've relayed that request. There has been at least one other incident in the past that I'm aware of where somebody returning to another country had tested positive and then on second test it were proved to be a negative test. We have got our contact tracing system kicking into gear though. We will contact trace everybody who was on the domestic flight that the person concerned took between Auckland and Christchurch. We'll do all of the relevant contact tracing at the border, and we're working with South Korea to obtain the information that we need to do other contact tracing in New Zealand, simply as a precaution.
Yeah, I think other relevant information relevant to this particular case, as the Minister has said, we have had a false positive before. We're also aware that the individual in question did spend before returning to New Zealand, did spend several months in the United States until mid-March. Of course, we have had cases where people have had COVID in the past and still shown signs of that sometime thereafter. So there's a number of other possible explanations here, but a precautionary approach has been taken.
Do you have confidence that you would be able to detect community transmission with the continuing low level of testing?
Testing has started to increase over the last week, and I'm leaning very heavily on that because it's not at the level that I want to see it at. I want to see it more at the minimum 4,000 tests a day. I do acknowledge that it goes down on the weekends, and it has ever since we started doing COVID testing. But during the week, we've made it very clear we expect to see testing around the community more at that 4,000 a day level. I do get a geographical spread of all of the test results so that I can see where we might need to really ramp up our focus. And I get also an ethnic breakdown as well. So if there are particular communities that we're not sampling enough of, we can up those numbers. So I'm working very closely with health to make sure that our community sampling is sufficient to give us that degree of confidence.
Only 280 people were tested in the community yesterday, though. It's so significantly below that 4,000 number. How do
I'm
we
going to jump
actually
in. It's just not wise to use Sundays or even indeed Saturdays as a guide for testing. It never has been. That's why we've always used the 7-day rolling. I think clearly you're hearing from us that we would like to see that testing higher, and the Minister is working actively to lift those rates. But unfortunately, for some reason, New Zealanders aren't seeking testing on weekends. But we still do want to see those numbers lift. Yeah.
Is there any update
The Māori Party is saying that some of your policies and announcements, including clean energy, are almost identical to theirs. Would you consider a coalition with them should they get in?
I unfortunately can't comment too directly because I haven't necessarily seen all of the policies which they are claiming have some similarity. What I have said is obviously I've demonstrated in this term of office those parties that we have been able to work with, but the rest for me all feels like a hypothetical. We are campaigning hard on behalf of the Labour Party, and that includes in those seats where the Māori Party contests, we will be campaigning for Labour.
Just on coalition arrangements, over the weekend, former National MP Jamie Lee Rost announced a seeming merger with the Public Party, who has some questionable views around COVID-19 and your own government as well. Do you think it's wise for those sort of views to be catapulted in the mainstream or discussed openly?
Look, I think any suggestion that New Zealanders should not take COVID-19 seriously, any suggestion that people should be wary of life-saving vaccination, any suggestion that COVID somehow is part of a conspiracy, yes, I push hard against very strongly, and I'd like to think that by and large you'll hear that out of the democracy here in Parliament as well.
So what would be your message to some people that are seemingly tagging on to this movement?
That we are an evidence-based government, that all of the decisions we've made have been based on research, science and evidence, and all of the decisions have been made in the best interests of looking after the health and well-being of New Zealanders. We live in an internet age and a social media age where conspiracy theories, which have always existed, flow more easily and freely. But again, I just encourage people to feel assured that we use a very strong evidence base in everything we do.
Has there been any update on the Michael Heron leak inquiry?
You may recall that when I launched the inquiry, or asked the SEC to launch the inquiry, we set a time frame of reporting back by the end of the month, and you'll be aware that there's only a few days left to go. So I imagine that we'll be talking about this again before the end of the week.
Yeah.
Just back to South Korea.
Sorry, did I take your question? Forgive me. I had an order of things, forgive me.
But back to South Korea, how disappointing is it that the government won't play ball in terms of the charges of the Korean diplomat who's alleged to have indecently assaulted a Kiwi?
Yeah, I don't feel that this issue has been concluded. Obviously, it's still very active from the New Zealand Police's perspective, and because of that, you'll continue to see New Zealand advocating for the ongoing engagement of the Korean government in this case.
What can you do? I mean, it effectively has concluded. It's stalled. He's in the Philippines. He won't come here. The police can't bring him here. What can be done?
Extradition matters ultimately are decisions there for the police, but we can, as a government, continue to advocate for our law to be upheld, regardless of who it is that we're talking about. New Zealand takes a very principled view on these issues. Regardless of whether you're a diplomat or a New Zealand citizen, the law is the law, and we will continue to advocate for justice to be done.
Are the police actually looking at extradition?
Ultimately, that is a question and a matter for them regardless.
Disappointed in the response, though?
As I've already said, I don't believe this has concluded.
Update on the Trans-Tasman bubble work that's happening, and how is the situation that's unfolding in Victoria impacting the progress of that work?
Obviously, it will slow things down because, as we've always said, we have to be assured that any opening of a border between New Zealand and Australia would be safe. Obviously, that is not the case now. We've also said that some of our broad criteria does include the period of time of which a country has proven to be free of community transmission. So definitely it has slowed things down. The work between officials continues, but I don't expect to see any opening in the immediate future at all.
What's the state of the Cook Islands air bridge?
Well, that work's actually underway. So as I said, I'd spoken to Prime Minister Puna, said that Cabinet has mandated officials to do that work, and that's been done, and so they are engaging directly with their counterparts in realm countries, so particularly Niue and the Cook Islands. Again, it's not one way though, so it is up to those countries. Obviously, Cook Islands have expressed that they're very keen. Niue, I think, have some of their own considerations around when it might be likely for them.
New Zealand have already been briefed on this and are actually ready to basically
Sorry,
release,
what was that?
I understand Air New Zealand have already been briefed on this and are actually ready to release flight schedules tonight, but is there some kind of delay that's kept it from happening?
Oh, that's actually, I mean, that when you say ready to release schedules, that doesn't mean ready to start. Equally, it is not just about Air New Zealand, it's about what happens within the airports as well. And in fact, that's the one of the most important considerations. As I've already said in this forum before, if you pass through an airport presently, there is every chance that you could come in contact with transiting passengers who have come in from high-risk countries. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to guarantee absolute separation of those passengers, both going out, departing to realm countries and coming in, and that is critical. We've got to get that right.
To say that it's the airport staff that's holding stuff up right
No,
now.
I don't think it's a fair statement to say things are being held up. Just a fair statement to say we're being rigorous and making sure that we get all of the details right. This needs to include intricate planning. Remember that this would mean quarantine-free travel. We don't take that lightly. Particularly, we're engaging with countries who have particular vulnerabilities. We do not want to be responsible for anything going wrong.
Happy birthday for yesterday.
Oh, thank you. Why do I feel like that's going to be followed up by something else? Why couldn't you just, an unqualified happy birthday? Thank you. Any other questions?
Did you receive any noteworthy gifts or messages? I'm interested in how the Prime Minister celebrates their 40th birthday.
Oh, well, like everyone else, actually, a bit of cake and a bit of quiet time. That's actually not true. Not like everyone else. I don't think anyone else probably reads cabinet papers on their birthday, but I did. So
briefcase cake, the one that you put on Instagram.
It was fantastic. Yeah. Yep. Heavy on the fondant, as you can imagine. But any last questions? I'll take two more. Audrey, and then the front.
You said you were going to be talking to other leaders this week. Which ones in particular?
I will be speaking with the Prime Minister of Japan, and I will be speaking with the President of Korea. Last question.
Just on the migrant workers announcement today, it includes creating a new visa that will support migrants to leave exploitative situations.
Why are these changes so significant for that community?
We of course want to make sure that no one is penalised for either raising when there are exploitative conditions or for the fact that they may have conditions that relate to a specific employer, and I think it's only fair that we have the ability for people not to be penalised for that. Okay, thanks everyone.
With international students...
Oh, I'm going to let you away with it one last time.
Thank you. The commitment to have smaller cohorts next year, is that from the first semester or trimester of next year?
We haven't put any specific timeframes on that at this point.
Of next year.
Look, again, that would just be pure speculation at the moment. We're moving as quickly as we can.
Okay. Oh, no, that's just cheeky. Thank you.